Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Unstoppable Dad Project. Appreciate you joining me here on the podcast for another week. Before I get into today's topic, please make sure you're subscribed on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. You'll be able to find the podcast on all the major podcast platforms. And if that platform allows you to, give us a follow, give us a subscribe, and leave us a 5-star review. By doing that, it helps the podcast continue to grow. And also, if you know anybody who might find some value out of what it is that we are doing here, just like yourself, please share this episode around with them. You can find the video versions of the podcast on the YouTube and the Facebook page. So jump on there, give us a subscribe, give the video a like. And by doing all that, you'll help the podcast continue to see the amazing growth that it has over the last 3 years. This week, title of the episode is Do Your Behaviors Match Your Values? And you can flip that saying around to Do your values match your behaviors? But the reason I wanted to talk about this is because understanding your values and is kind of like an operating system for how we address life. And for me personally, and for a lot of people that I've coached over the years, when you don't inherently understand your values and you don't have a set of values that you're working towards, it can make things very hard, because what tends to happen when we don't understand that set of values and we don't have that personal operating system that we're trying to work towards, we're doing things that potentially don't align with what's important to us. And it can be a hard thing to actually understand your own values, because there's a lot of external inputs that are going to come into that for a lot of people. It can start with something as simple as like our upbringing. Some of our values can be inherited from our parents, from those people that have had an influence on us over the course of our life. It can be from just any external circumstance or environment that comes in. Maybe our values get heavily influenced by our work and what we do. Like maybe that's important to us. Maybe it's not important to us, but we're doing it anyway, but there's a secondary reason why we have to do it. Like there are all these external inputs which can sometimes make it very noisy in our mind when we're trying to work out like what are those values. And understanding your own personal set of values, I think, is extremely important from the point of view of living a happy life. It's not going to be a stress-free life. It's probably not even going to be an easy life, especially if you're somebody like myself who constantly wants to drive to be better. If you're constantly working to be better, there's always going to be some level of stress and some level of friction. But I think from the point of view of stress, there's chosen stress and there's not chosen stress. And we've got to be able to respond to both. And for me, right now in my life, like I'm in a point where a lot of the stress that I'm experiencing is all chosen stress. Like I'm choosing to do extra stuff and put myself under extra pressure in order to grow. But a lot of what I'm doing is aligned with my value set and what's important to me. And again, I use that word operating system, but if we're thinking of it, and we're not machines, right? Like we're emotional beings, but if we have that value set, it kind of gives us that North Star that we can always go back to whenever we feel like we're getting off track. So I really wanted to talk about for a little bit this week, just setting up yourself where, what can we do to understand our values? Because it's a really hard thing to do. And I don't think that understanding your values is something where you can sit down with a pen and paper for an hour and just have it all worked out. I think values within ourselves, values that we want to operate by and we want to work towards and we want to work to be better. Firstly, it's a constantly evolving thing. Like your values are going to change, I believe, over the course of your life. If we just look at something as simple as parenthood, moving from not being a parent to being a parent, that's probably going to be one of the times in anybody's life where one of the where your values are going to shift dramatically, because you almost move from a state of being able to be more selfish about what's important to you, working towards things that are for you and you alone, into having to worry about other people in this world. And yes, we should obviously be mindful of other people and things like that, but when we're doing things and we're single or we're newly married or we're in a new relationship, our values are going to shift from, if we're single, we only really have to worry about ourselves. So the values and the operating system and the things that we're doing and the actions, habits, and behaviors that we are going to do are going to be a very selfish thing, because we only have to worry about ourselves. Then from there, when we get into this long-term relationship, our values are going to shift a little bit, and they're going to shift to worrying about this other person that we care deeply about, and potentially looking at building a life together. And even at that point, for some of us, I know for me personally, when that happened, the mindset started to shift to a little bit more long term, and we started thinking about kids and getting married and building a life together. So our values become less selfish and start more thinking about another person, one other person. But there's still an element where the value system that we're operating by, I think, when we're in that mode, is still very selfish, because the person that we're with is an adult. They're going to have their own set of values, their own set of goals that they're working towards. So even though it's going to shift, it's not going to shift greatly. But then when we have kids, it's going to shift greatly, because we have people within our lives that are 100% wholly dependent on us. And that is probably, for me, so far in my life, that's been the number one time where my values have almost taken a complete 180. And it's also a time for a lot of dads that I've spoken to and a lot of people that I've worked with, and myself included, where you feel really lost, right? You feel like sometimes you're very overwhelmed, and obviously it's a very emotional time. There's a lot of stuff happening, and I believe now, and this is probably going to change, a lot of that comes about from we are having this major shift in values because we have had a major life change. And so starting to unpack and understand what those values are is not necessarily going to be as easy as sitting down with a pen and paper for 5 minutes and then just jotting some things down. It's going to be a process that we're going to have to work through in order for us to truly understand what those values are. And one of the things with values is, even though we're going to inherit some of them from our upbringing, from our environment, from things we've heard, we have to understand that the values that we have need to be ours and ours alone. And if they're not, and if they're influenced by something else, this is something that I've been guilty of, right? And I've coached people, and I know I've done it, where you'll hear something from somebody around like a value set, right? Whether it be making money or whatever the case might be. And you're like, geez, that sounds good. But then when you actually start to take action and move things towards that particular set of values, there's like this massive disconnect. It doesn't feel good taking that action. And it's because you're trying to force somebody else's values on your own, and it just doesn't fit, right? Like, it's very hard to make that fit. It has to be important to us. It has to be something that means something to us. So even though our values can be influenced by our environment, we have to make sure that they're ours and ours alone, because if they're not, there's not. The actions that we start to take can feel really disconnected and really, really hard. Now, even when we're taking actions that align with our values, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. For me, one thing that I've understood in my life, if I'm taking an action that is more aligned with my value set, while it's still going to be hard, and I'm not always going to feel like doing it, like I'm going to sometimes feel demotivated, because it aligns with something that is extremely important to me. It means it's easier to work through those harder times and to work through that resistance. And especially if you are making a habit change in order to align with a new set of values or a newfound set of values or something that you've just started to understand, there's always going to be some form of resistance whenever you're trying to implement change. I've said that on the podcast a lot, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't quite get, or the penny doesn't drop whenever they start something new. They think that it should be easy all the time. And you know what? If it is implementing something you should probably new and it's for your enjoyment, like let's say you're trying to implement a new health regime, you should enjoy it more than you don't. Absolutely. But there's always going to be some level of resistance that comes up because it's a new habit, it's a new behavior. Whenever you're implementing something new, you're always going to find some level of friction within that. But having that set of values and that North Star and that operating system that you can always go back to just means that, all right, like, I don't really feel like doing this now, but this is why I'm doing it, because it's important to me for these particular reasons. But those reasons have to be yours. They can't be given to you by somebody else. And yes, again, those values are going to be implemented by our upbringing, potentially our family, our parents, things like that. But if you don't align with those, if you don't feel like they're important to you, all it is it's just a hollow thing which is going to at some point cause an inordinate amount of friction. And what I've found is when I've picked up a value, what I think is a good value from somebody else, but it doesn't actually mean something to me, not only it bleeds into everything else because it's just not aligned with who I am as a person. And a lot of this all comes back to knowing yourself. I think one of the biggest superpowers for a lot of people is just understanding yourself, understanding what drives you, understanding what makes you tick, understanding what's important to you. Like, all these things are so important, and being objective about it. Because when you get, and maybe it's just because I'm getting a little bit older, ever since I've turned 40, I've been in this really retrospective mindset, right? And it's probably been reflected within the podcast and the things you've been hearing. But I think once you understand who you are and what drives you, things do become easier because you start to do things that align with that. And when you stop caring about what other people think about what you're doing, then it becomes easier to take that action and keep moving forward. But trying to find those values is going to be a process, right? I'll give you an idea on some of my values. The number one value for me is my family. Okay. And from there, physical and mental health and independence and autonomy is another one that's a high value for me. And what I mean by independence and autonomy is not being tied to anything from the point of view of how I'm going to provide for my family. So that'll be things like, going, and it may be things like what I'm doing here, where we've got the podcast. So it's being able to have that freedom and flexibility to do things and provide for my family without being reliant on any one thing. So there's some of my values, but most of those values feed into the other. Physical health and mental health, even though it might not seem like it, actually feeds into the number one value for me, which is family. So every value that I think, when you understand your operating system and your value set, one generally feeds into the other. Like the independence, the autonomy, all feeds into that. Another value that I have is being able to help people. It's one of the reasons why I've become a coach. It's one of the reasons why I do this. Now, that is almost a value on its own, but that also feeds into the mental health side of things, because I get great joy from helping people and seeing people progress. So those four values for me are all intertwined, and it's going to be the same pretty much for everybody across the board once you start to understand those value sets. And that doesn't mean those values that I've gone through have to be yours. Yours will be different. They may be similar, but they are probably going to be very different based off your individual experience, your individual set of goals, and your individual set of circumstances. But one thing I have, as I was writing down notes for this podcast and kind of thinking about the topics that I wanted to cover off, one thing that really stood out for me is with the values, I think they are all intertwined on a level. I think you would probably, for me, like I would rank them as a hierarchy. And the reason why I'd rank them, and this comes back to implementing habits and schedule and finding time for the things that are important. But the reason why, in my mind, they're ranked is because, let's say, for example, I need to do something that is going to impact on I need to do something which is maybe going to help with the autonomy, like my autonomy, so business wise, but it's going to impact on my time to train, like my physical and mental health. I'm going to prioritize the physical and mental health side of things, because for me, that is a higher value than the other action that I'm doing. It's the same with family time. Like, I'm going to make sure that that's kind of at the top of that list, and I've got that blocked out in my calendar, as much as that is robotic for me, and nothing else in life will ever impact that, because that is at the top of my value list. So I think not only is it important to understand those values that you've got, but it's also important to understand where they rank for you. And again, that is going to be yours and yours alone. And we do need to spend some time, whether it be meditating, whether it be journaling, on a consistent basis, I think, to understand that, in order to be effective and efficient with our time, and to get the most out of the time that we have here, and to be to be in that moment, and to be able to give ourselves permission to do things and to move things forward, and to start to get everything moving in a direction. Because I think when we are taking actions that are disconnected from our value system, what I've observed in my life and what I've felt, like during the times where I've felt, the most anxious, or even where I've felt a little bit, I felt in a depressive state, it's been when I've been doing things that don't align with my value set. And that can be, I'm not spending as much time with my family, like I'm not doing, and I don't understand what the operating system is that I'm basing these decisions off. And that's where everything feels like it's up in the air, where I feel like I'm going through those times where I'm in quicksand and I'm just working my ass off and I'm not getting anywhere. And the harder I go, the deeper I sink. And when I look back on some of those times, for me, it's been when I haven't really understood the set of values that I'm working on and I'm working towards, and why things are important to me. So I think, as a foundation for a lot of people, if you can take some time regularly to understand what your values are, and then constantly reassess those, because I think they will change over time. For some of us, I think you may get to a point in life, and this is just a theory I've got, right? I think because we develop, like our brain is developing quickly, and our life changes so dramatically, from our teenage years all the way through to our 20s and our early 30s. And then when you get to your mid 30s, sometimes for a lot of us, life starts to settle out a bit. But I think your values change very quickly early on in life, because circumstances change very early on. And then potentially you get to a point in life where things start to settle out a little bit, and your values become a little bit more set. And maybe it's the values themselves that stay the same. So, you might have the same 4 values, but the hierarchy of those values changes. And it's a little bit more fluid. But if you're not taking the time to understand that, then it can feel very hard to add more stuff in, to find time to do stuff, you feel a little bit anxious about making a decision about saying no to something, because understanding value, your own set of values, can help you actually work out what opportunities you should be saying no to and what you should be saying yes to. And these are all things that can impact our physical and mental health, because we then don't find time for ourselves because we prioritize things that maybe aren't important to us, and then we don't feel good about doing those things because we've let this other thing go which was maybe more important to us. And as a result, it can feel like we're caught in this little bit of a spiral, and we're in that, to use the term again, quicksand, where it's very hard to get out of. And sometimes we need to take that step back to assess our lives, to know ourselves, and to understand the set of values that we want to work towards, so that then we can set up those actions, habits, and behaviors to align with that. And I feel like when I'm in alignment and I'm taking actions to work towards things that are important to me, I just know that I'm happier, even though, it is self-induced stress and there are stressful times and there are hard actions that need to be taken. Whenever there's that alignment there with the vast majority of my life, I just feel happier. Life feels better. I'm able to be more present in the times that I have with those people that are important to me. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you think you understand your values, because I'm only at a point now at almost 41 years of age where I'm only feeling right now like I'm understanding them in this moment. And it's taken to now to kind of get to that point. And you know what? That's going to change. That's always not going to be the same. It's going to be fluid. It's going to be personal to me, like it's going to be personal to you. If you need help with anything, please reach out. You can reach us on the social media. So at The Unstoppable Dad on Instagram, The Unstoppable Dad Project on Facebook. Make sure you give us a like, share, subscribe on the podcast, on the video version. And I will see you all next week. Goodbye.